Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It is Tuesday here in the American Midwest, Upper Midwest, I guess you could say. It's a foggy day outside, pretty thick pea soup happening. Uh, Hope you all are enjoying the series so far and the great American jazz players who passed too early. Not just Americans, we're going to touch on a few European players as well. One of the things that kind of struck me about episode one on this series, looking back, and my wife kind of was what mentioned it to me when we talked about all those guys who died in their 40s. She's like, how many of them are black? And it's no secret that healthcare in this country is very uh, set up for the wealthy. And if you have less than finances, your regular health and support and care are greatly diminished. Myself, even as a DJ who's done okay, I've not had healthcare most of my life here in America. It's just a fact of life here. It's just most of the insurance plans are so unaffordable, they don't make sense. And you still have to pay deductibles on stuff, and so you don't really get to the insurance on something unless you're like literally hospitalized. It's such a ridiculous system. But so I counted the number of blacks versus whites in that first 35 that we covered, and here's the shocking number: 33 of the 35 were black, and that's 93%. And they don't make up more than what, 20% of the population. And it's not like the black jazz musicians were more proficient or more populated. If anything, it was probably more white jazz musicians because there were so many white bands in need of in offering being offered work. Every different town had to have a few white swing bands to play parties and events and weddings. So there's tons of white jazz musicians, and we were covering that era. And in all the research I did, I was just looking for name people that were still regarded with some degree of popularity today by the critics and the writers and the historians. So there was no consideration of race that went into it. I was just looking up these different lists, and for 33 of the 35 to be uh, African American, that's a scary, scary telling statistic. I think in today's episode we're going to be doing about 33 or 34 as well. I think there's 6 white guys in this, so the percentage is a little better, but it's dramatically different. The 2 white guys in part one that we talked about were Django Reinhardt, who passed away at 43 from a brain hemorrhage, of course, the Belgian, and then Glenn Miller, who died during World War II over the English Channel. So not exactly a healthcare provider issue in America. So when it comes to American healthcare, guys like Chet Baker did all the drugs in the world, somehow managed to stay alive. And yet the black guys just weren't offered that same degree of healthcare and didn't have the same degree of finance. And people are often so misguided when they think that the name black players of the 30s, 40s, and 50s were well-to-do and popular. And a lot of those guys are more popular today than they were in their lifetime. And so it wasn't like they had the money to have healthcare programs. A lot of these guys were eating hand to mouth, playing every day to keep themselves fed and high. And drugs for a lot of them was medication. Sadly, alcohol became medication for a lot of them, sadly, which contributes to a lot of their dying. It's a shocking number, a shocking revealing statistic on health in the American system. And also one of the most shocking numbers that there is the average American life expectancy of a black male is a lot shorter than the average life expectancy of a white male. And again, it's got nothing to do with skin color. It's got to do with economics. But in America here, we sort economics a lot along racial lines. So we end up with these awful statistics that are just disgusting. Just disgusting. I just can't get my head around some of it sometimes. How we could be so burying our head in the sand, acting like it. People say, well, we don't want to talk about race. Race is American history. You can't talk American history and not talk race. You can't talk jazz and not talk about race. It's just a huge part of the story. So, again, I'm kind of moved by some of this stuff to the point of angry tears. You know, you look at the treatment of a guy like Bud Powell. God, one of the commenters says he's reading his biography, a book that was actually sent to me. I never got to read it yet. I will sit down and read at some point. I've been helping my brother out at a shop across town some during the day. And between going to the gym, I'm down 10 pounds. That's a fantastic feeling, I'll tell you that. You know what I mean? Getting my little fitness back on a little bit, starting to make a few jump shots, coming together. Mr. Rick Barry, Golden State Warriors, 76, 77. This was a title team in the mid 70s, along with the great Nate Thurmond. Really cool jersey, wonderful stitching. Look on the back. He's got the San Francisco streetcars, which is pretty cool. But race is just part of the story. And if you really want to be woke, then you need to know some of this stuff. Because woke doesn't exist outside of truth. I mean, woke is not just sticking your head in the sand saying we don't talk about that stuff. It's the reality of things, things that are and will be, and still are. Black males are still dying 60 years younger than white males in this country. It's unacceptable. It's just not. Your color shouldn't determine how early you die. But in America, it's absolutely part of the dynamic at play here. So anyway, let's jump into people who died in their 30s. Part 2. There's a part 3 coming. So hold your horses. Don't get too excited. Trying to say, oh, you forgot somebody, because I didn't forget no one. At least not none of the big names, you know. Again, there's thousands of jazz players we're not discussing here. We're just kind of discussing more popular names that have some carryover into the present for the most part. So we're going to start with age 39. And again, we're not talking decades here. We're talking age when they passed. I think some people got that confused last episode. We weren't talking about people who died in the 40s. We were talking about people who died in their 40s. So that could have been any time in 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. You know, if you were a great jazz musician and you died in your 40s, that's what that list was about. These are guys who died in their 30s, starting with Shadow Wilson, a great drummer who had a lot of promise. It seemed like he was going to go on to big things, and he had a bad drug habit. He worked with a lot of greats on the East Coast and some on the West Coast. I think he's on some Billie Holiday sessions, if I recall. I've liked a lot of the places where Shadow Wilson has turned up. Always on great recordings and great sessions. We lost Shadow at the age of 39. Again, the heroin drug addiction is such a tragedy. And for those historians who've looked into it, how that drugs got into the black neighborhoods it's really a war crime. It's really an act of giving blankets filled with polio to the natives. It's no different. We like to think that we're so much more civilized than Putin or how we worked 300 years ago. And we're just as devious and driven by greed and have no shame. Nothing's changed. It's the level of disgust I have for the planet I live on sometimes. It just raises my blood. Is there a better option somewhere? Can I go somewhere where we're not this disgusting? Where we can't even have an honest discourse about how things are? Booker Irvin, the great Texas tenorman, who comes on the heels of Rollins and Coltrane. He's kind of that guy ascending in the 60s. And as Coltrane passes in 67, Booker is like a candidate for kind of being Coltrane, where Coltrane was in the early 60s. Spiritual, some elements of avant-garde and free, but still rooted in the blues and the black church. Irvin has a lot of gospel in him, a lot of blues in him, but he can tackle some of the more edgier sounds at times. Booker's a great player, and he made some great recordings, especially the stuff at Prestige. There's a session that was at King that came out in Bethlehem. I think there's another session he did that shows up on Savoy, is it? And but it's really his Prestige work, the Space Book, the Cookbook, all those book records are really seminal recordings by him, and they're actually great examples of once Prestige sheds New Jazz and sheds the Jazz, the Swingsville and the Mooseville labels, everything just starts being on the 7,000 sequence again. And so when those Booker records start coming out in the 7400s and 7500s, it's mixed in with all that soul jazz and organ jazz and stuff that's going on Prestige. Those Booker Irvin records are smack in the middle of that, showing that Prestige still had a fairly broad swath going on. Booker then moves to Blue Note. And I think he moves to Blue Note post Fail to Liberty. And he makes some fine records there as well. But then he passes in the early 70s. And just a real loss. He died from kidney disease, which is not often. I know liver disease with alcohol. Is kidney disease with alcohol as well? I'm not sure. But again, Booker was a great player who made some great records. It's sad we lost him so young at 39. Fats Waller, one of the great personalities of jazz. Along with guys like Sidney Bechet and Louis Armstrong in the 20s and 30s, Fats Waller was a big deal. He was a crossover star. White America kind of knew something about him. If you look at the major labels in the 50s, they were reissuing Fats Waller's work along with Armstrong and Ellington. So he ascended into a kind of a crossover position. He had a real tongue-in-cheek, comical, sexual, innuendo-laced persona. Everything had this kind of double and triple meaning. Just a real character that was one of the most fun players. He's kind of part of that James P. Johnson, Willie the Lion Smith, Harlem Stride sound that happened in the teens and 20s. A really innovative player, one of the great composers of that era as well, along with Fats Waller's work, has worked its way into the jazz canon still to this day. Ain't misbehaving? Well, he probably is. Waller misbehaves just quite a lot, actually. And even guys like Louis Jordan, I feel like are borrowing some of Fats Waller's shtick. That tongue in the cheek, that bug eye, kind of funny, comical punchline. There's some Fats Waller going on in what Louis Jordan and those early R&B guys were doing. Fats was a very important player, and we lost him to bronchial pneumonia, sadly. And then one of my favorite players of all, Wynton Kelly, one of the great piano players, one of the guys that Miles Davis was just awful to. He eventually, Wynton Kelly, when he quits Miles' group in the early 60s, he takes Paul Chambers and Jimmy Cobb with him, and they form their own trio, free of that figure who was not the most fun to be around. And, of course, Miles had gotten sober, and that affected some of why some of the other guys wanted to play with him or not. I'm not sure how much of a drug addict Wynton Kelly was. I really don't know. But he's one of the real establishers of groove, along with a guy like Ray Bryant. These guys really laid down groove, Horace Silver, pattern, elements of funk in jazz. Had great spatial recognition, knew how to open up for the soloists. When he was soloing, he knew how to fill. Miles Davis, in spite of some of their relationship problems, had a great faith and confidence in Wynton Kelly. He knew he could leave the stage if Wynton was up there, and Wynton would keep things together. I like a lot of Wynton's solo work. It's somewhat sporadic. There's an early session on Blue Note in the early 50s. That's 10-inch stuff that got reissued on 12-inch eventually. I think it's only a Japanese 12-inch, actually. Then he does a couple records at Riverside, late 50s, early 60s that are great stuff. His stuff on Verve and with Paul and Jimmy Cobb, some of it's on Verve, so it kind of compromises some of its jazz blues element. But Wynton's such a great player. His body of work as a sideman is really proficient. And he actually dies of a seizure in Toronto, my hometown, sadly, in early 70s from an epileptic seizure. Toronto has some peripheral jazz stories going on, from the Massey Hall concert with Mingus and Parker and all those guys to Wynton Kelly's passing. Toronto does show up in the narrative here and there. So that's 39. Moving on to 38. We lost the great Bobby Timmons. Bobby Timmons was one of the great members of the Jazz Messengers, along with Art Blakey and company. His tenure in the Jazz Messengers, for me, is probably one of the greatest eras of the Jazz Messengers. He's there with Shorter and Morgan and Fuller, just Jamie Merritt, of course, Art Blakey, of course. He's just a great composer, great arranger. His songs have all of the staples of what a Jazz Messenger song should have, with pattern, groove, repetition, plenty of room for solos, interesting chord arrangements. Workin' and That Dare are two of his famous arrangements that are staples of the jazz canon to this day. I think Moanin' might have been another composition of his. Just a huge element of what the Jazz Messengers and hard bop, going into kind of post hard bop modernism. He's just a real proponent of the black foundations of the music, the church, the gospel, the blues. It's all present in what Bobby Timmons has to say. He, of course, moves on to be a solo artist and makes some great records at Prestige all throughout the 60s. But we lost him to cirrhosis of the liver. So I guess that's an alcohol-related death right there. And we lost British star Tubby Hayes at the age of 38 to heart trouble. And I can't elaborate too much on Tubby Hayes. Like I said, I know some of his work through Jazzland, and I know he played with a lot of the other greats in London at that time, guys like Joe Harriott and the club owner. I can't think of his name right now. It's slipping my mind. Slipping my tongue. 1 second. Ronnie Scott, Dizzy Reese. He was part of that whole scene, Tubby. Great player, real modern, with roots going back into bebop, and even part of the swing era. He was, Tubby had a great, honored career. And it was sad that we lost him to heart trouble at the age of 38. 37, we lost some great players here at 37. The great Larry Young dies from pneumonia. Larry was a fantastic organ player, and he comes in early, kind of imitating Jimmy Smith like every organ player was, playing bebop and hard bop and some elements of soul jazz and rhythm and blues. But he actually ends up tackling some fairly out material when he shows up at Blue Note, and some of his records in the mid-60s to late 60s are some pretty off-the-map organ records. There's not a lot of organ that lends itself to the avant-garde, and Larry Young is really delving into some of those sounds, and he really had lineups in those records too that enabled him to really explore some of the peripheral sounds of jazz. So we lost the great Larry Young, obviously too early at 37. George Tucker, great bass player. He was playing as a backup guy, session guy, and a live musician with all the greats of that time. Blue Note, Riverside. He's just a prolific player, lots of recordings, and he dies from a cerebral hemorrhage, sadly on stage while playing with the great Kenny Burrell. And so that's going to be a bit of a set killer. You're over there doing your thing, playing a little jazz somewhere, and your bass player falls over and dies. That's a tough night. Sadly, in the black world, it's so much more commonplace. I remember when I was DJing with him, when someone would die, or it's more expected. It's hard to say that, but it is. It's more expected. It's more commonplace. It's more taken with a grain of salt. Tragedy, arrests, shootings, early passings. Even since that gig happened, a lot of the great regular members I had at that gig that were in their 50s and early 60s, a lot of those guys have passed away. Way too many. Some of them in their 40s. Still today, And I have their grieving widows still on my Facebooks. And every year when the anniversary of their husband's passing, they post a memorial and say how much they miss their husband, speaking to him up in heaven. And you're just like, oh yeah, I can't believe he's been dead now 4 years, 5 years. These guys are in their 50s and 40s. And it's just, I'm not talking one or two. I'm talking at least a half dozen guys that were regulars on my gig from 2010 to 2015 have since passed away. It's tough being a black male in America, man. So George Tucker on stage with Kenny Burrell, that's tough. The great Oscar Pettiford dies at 37. Oscar Pettiford's an Oklahoman. He's got some Native American in him as well as black. And he's a great proponent of early bebop and one of the most important bass players of that era. He's kind of a descendant of Jimmy Blanton in some way. Blanton's career ends so short, so young, and we'll get to him in the next episode. But he's a prolific bass player that plays with great tonality. He introduces the cello as an instrument in jazz. He bows, he plucks, he strums, he chords. Pettifer's the real deal, man. He takes the bass from being kind of just a backing instrument, playing notes like a tuba, and makes the bass an instrument that can be a lead instrument. And there's some recordings of him with Vin Babison where they're playing cello together. Early 7 inches I have, and just the dynamic of these players, how proficient and eloquent they are on instruments that don't really lend themselves to that kind of virtuosity. These guys have it. They just have this ability to drain soul and the blues out of whatever's in there at their disposal. They can master any instrument. And that's the thing about black jazz musicians is almost every one of those instruments in jazz was not a black instrument. It was an instrument that the black community reinvents and gives it a new sound, a new shape, a new rhythm, a new groove. And none of the instruments in jazz ever sounded like they sounded in jazz before that. Trumpets, saxophones, none of it. None of it sounded like how Armstrong or Coleman Hawkins made them sound. No one even envisioned that a trumpet could sound like that. A saxophone, that's just for marching along and honking. You're going to play that kind of, wow. It was mind-blowing. And we lose that perspective here in the present because we don't think of it in that light, in that context. But every instrument they touched, they took it into their kingdom and reinvented it from stem to stern. And that was part of the amazing thing to the white musical classical crowd, was hearing what the black musicians were doing with these classical European instruments and completely changing everything that those instruments were supposed to be about and do. And if you listen to a guy like Julius Watkins play the French horns were never envisioned for that. You know what I mean? Ray Draper on the tuba, no one saw that coming. Oscar Pettifer on the bass, on the cello. These are innovative men and women who just are so brilliant and so creative. Pettifer was such a force. He really was. His recordings at Bethlehem are fantastic. His work with Lucky Thompson at ABC, those are great groups. He does a couple of big group ensembles at ABC Records as well in 55, 56. Just real cutting edge, modern groups. Great arrangers of the group like Gigi Christ. You got to give it up to Oscar Pettifer. He's one of the real legends that kind of is a little under the radar today to collectors. I think people get him confused with Oscar Peterson. Oscar Pettifer, it's kind of a little bit confusing. But Pettifer is just a real, I hate to use the word, but he's a genius. He's a really clever guy. And I don't throw that word out very often. Things I don't say is I don't ever say this is a masterpiece. That's a very rare thing for me to say about something. I think I said it about that Ellington record last week. And that's a masterpiece. It is. It's just from stem to stern, it's a wonderful recording that anybody can embrace. But I don't throw that word around because you diminish its value when you use it too often. Same with not calling people geniuses. You can't call everyone a genius. You can't call every record brilliant. You have to point out what it does and does well without using those big superlatives because they lose their meaning if you overuse them. But Pettifer truly does belong in a place of high esteem. He goes to Denmark, I think it is, or I know it was in Europe for sure, in like the late 50s. He does some recordings over there. And then sadly, he passes away. He had a virus that was similar to polio. And so whatever that means. But he just passed pretty suddenly. And what a great loss for the Jazz Kingdom that was, age of 37. And then speaking of Europe, we lost the great Bobby Jasper, a Belgian native who had some success in New York in the 50s, playing and recording at Riverside. He's a flautist and a sax player. He's kind of a legend back home in Belgium and probably even in Europe. He had some success here in America. He does some work with Herbie Mann at Prestige. He's certainly a fantastic player. And we lost Bobby Jasper to a heart attack at the age of 37. And so he's actually a white cat. So there's a white cat mixed in there. At the age of 36, we have another phenomenon, kind of like Pettiford. We have the great Eric Dolphy. Dolphy is one of the most talented, innovative, creative forces in jazz in the 60s, maybe even the late 50s. He's as important as Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane in some ways, even though his career was so much shorter than those guys. There's little question that when Coltrane's doing Africa Brass, a guy like Eric Dolphy's pushing Coltrane's boundaries, not the other way around. Dolphy inspired Charlie Mingus, not the other way around. Uh, Dolphy comes up in kind of benign circumstance out in Los Angeles. He goes to school with some other great jazz musicians. He's already in the circle coming out of high school. He starts playing with some of the West Coast cats, including Chico Hamilton. And Chico was pretty much a cool cat. And when he goes with Chico, they start edging and they're doing stuff that's kind of third stream, avant garde, meets cool, interesting stuff that Dolphy's helping propulse. And then Dolphy ends up working, like I said, with Mingus and Coltrane. And then you see a guy like Chico Hamilton moving over to Impulse and making some very avant-garde out records with guys like Charles Lloyd, directly inspired by Eric Dolphy's kind of going, hey, there's the doorway we can go through. Dolphy's a very creative guy. He's a saxophonist. He's a baritone, clarinetist. He's a multi-instrumentalist. But he's mostly a creative thinker and creative writer and arranger. I think Ellington would have loved to have worked with Eric Dolphy. They probably would have made some sweet marriage, some sweet music. Dolphy, again, is just a great figure. I don't think he was much of a drug addict at all, if I remember. I think he was a pretty clean living guy, from my understanding, if I remember correctly. Again, my brain's getting a little fuzzy. There's so much jazz information in there. I'm like, I hope when I'm speaking, I'm remembering correctly sometimes. And most of the time I check myself. I'm like, yeah, okay, that was right. Thankfully. But he died. He goes to Europe as well. They go to tour with Mingus in Europe. And during that tour, he decides he wants to stay. I don't think Mingus was too thrilled about losing him. But Dolphy's like, this is just a better place for me. How I'm being treated, I think I can be more creative in this kind of a place. And he ends up having kind of unpredicted diabetic coma and ends up passing away, I think in Switzerland or Austria. What a great loss for the Jazz Kingdom as well, with Eric Dolphy's passing. And Out to Lunch on Blue Note's fairly famous. And a lot of his prestige recordings are kind of like live stuff from Europe. And there's not enough Dolphy work. And to really appreciate Dolphy, you really have to kind of delve into his side work to see how he's impacting everybody around him, including Mingus and, like I said, Chico Hamilton and John Coltrane. When you're influencing those cats, you're doing something. Also, at the age of 36, we lost the great Leo Parker. And Parker was a fantastic baritonist, kind of on the peripheral of today's jazz canon, what people know about. But I've talked about before about the Unholy Four. I played with, I can see his name, Billy Eckstein. That great bebop big band crossover thing that they were doing. The Unholy Four were Dexter Gordon, Sonny Stitt, Gene Ammons, and Leo Parker on the baritone. So he's part of some great jazz lineage and heritage for sure. He has a couple of cool records at Blue Note that are worth picking up. He has some stuff at King that's fantastic with Bill Jennings, a guitar player. Parker's a great example of what the baritone sounds like. Has a lot of rhythm and blues in his sound. You gotta love Leo Parker. I also have Wynton Kelly here at the age of 36, and I also have him at 39, which we already talked about him. I'm gonna have to look which one's actually right. I don't remember if he died in 36 or 39 in terms of his age. So I could have had that wrong. He could be at 36. My notes made a mistake there, possibly. Spanky DeBrest works with Blakey and the Jazz Messengers in 1957. A great player with that Messenger group with Jackie McLean. Bill Harden was on the trumpet. Just a great group. And he's just another one of those figures that's kind of in the background in jazz. He works with guys like Ray Draper. He works on some Thelonious Monk sessions. He shows up in numerous places and kind of slips into obscurity. And then he passes away, sadly, at the age of 35. And I didn't even find the information on what he passed away from. But just such a young age to pass away. And he's definitely an important figure that deserves more recognition today. At the age of 35, we lost the great Joe Gordon. And Joe Gordon is a great trumpet player. He's got quite a bit of brightness and light in his sound, fairly dynamic, dexterous, somewhere between a Donald Byrd and a Freddie Hubbard. He's not as clear and as vibrant as a Hubbard, but he's certainly got a lot of that wonderful tonality of a Byrd or a Lee Morgan, even. Uh, really, a really player that would be more popular today if he had more work under his belt before he passed away. He does a couple sessions for MRC in the mid 50s. I think he works with Blakey a little bit then, actually, before the Jazz Messengers. And then he ends up on the West Coast and he makes a fine record for contemporary that's really worth seeking out. But where you'll hear Joe Gordon at his best is really at the Shelly Man at the Blackhawk series, those 4 records. Well, actually a 5th one now. If you hear that Blackhawk stuff, that's some of the best Joe Gordon you'll hear. Listen to that version of Summertime on volume 3 or 4, I think it is. It's just fantastic. Richie Kamuka is part of that group. Just a great West Coast cool meets modern. You know, I mean, it's cool bop in a lot of ways, like I've said. The Blackhawk records are fantastic, and Joe Gordon's a big part of that. And we lost him in a house fire, very sadly. A house fire sounds like an awful way to go. And how do you die in a house fire? Sort of being drugged or drunk, maybe. I don't know. But tragic, no question about it. Also, at the age of 35, we lost the great Specs Wright, who's a great drummer who shows up on a lot of sessions. He has a record of his own on Roulette that's actually a really good session. He's kind of part of the swing era, and then does a lot of work in the bebop days, into the hard bop days, and we lost him at the age of 35 as well. At the age of 34, we lose a lot of greats here, starting with Charlie Parker. We lost Parker to pneumonia and alcohol and drugs, of course. And Parker, it's hard to believe he was only 34 when he passed. The coroner thought he was like 60, if I remember. Like they thought he was twice the age that he was. The miles, the abuse, the drinking, the withdrawals, trying to quit heroin is as tough on your body as doing it. In fact, if you have a stable connection and do it in a clean environment, doing heroin can be, I'm not saying good for you, but it's like you can sustain it for a long time and live a long life. It's trying to leave heroin that's really tough on your body dynamics and really can kill you. A lot of guys die trying to quit, including guys like Jerry Garcia. Trying to get clean, it's tough. And it just breaks your body down. Your body becomes so used to that substance being there to help you sustain and go through your pain and aches and suffering. And withdrawal is a tough thing, especially when you're trying to go cold turkey. But Parker, just a tragic life. It's a pretty well-known story, so I don't have to delve into it too deeply here. But he's such an innovative voice and one of the greatest voices in jazz's history. Parker was just a guy that is more fun than people think to remember. He's not just this kind of straight-laced, drug-addled. He was a character. You know, he definitely had his problems, but there's a lot of joy in his sound and his playing. You can tell he has fun when he's ripping through that alto and doing the things that Parker does. Parker's just a revelation in music being that escape from my subconscious, from my what all that ails me. You know, Parker is such a institution in the history of jazz, and he should always be just revered and seen on as being hallowed ground. I'm not going to go much deeper on Parker because we all know the story, and if you don't know it, there's movies, there's documentaries. Parker's is a tragedy, and dying at 34, we just lost a lot in 55 when he passed away, and we lose Clifford Brown a few months later, and we'll get to him coming up. Albert Eiler, there's some mystery about his passing. Albert Eiler was a saxophonist coming up in the free era, inspired by Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, Pharoah Saunders. He's in that same ilk, as it were, and he's a really inventive player, but he's also got some gospel and some roots of the blues in him. His stuff kind of has different periods, and he dies drowning, but there's a question mark as to whether it might have actually been a suicide or even a murder, and that's something else you'll have to dive into. Eiler was a great player who was really respected by a lot of today's avant-garde free jazz collectors, and Eiler's a career that's very noteworthy and has great sustaining power in spite of his tragic early end. The great Wardell Gray, one of the great tenor saxophonists of the 40s, institution of the Central Avenue scene in Los Angeles in the 40s, along with guys like Dexter Gordon, Sonny Stitt, Sonny Chris. There's a lot of great players playing out in Los Angeles. Parker and Gillespie go out there to be part of that scene for a while in the late 40s. It was just a real hotbed for early bebop, and the sounds of New York were flourishing on Central Avenue in the black areas of Los Angeles. The white kids were flocking from the suburbs to hear what was going on. Wardell was a big part of all of that. And he was a great player, had a lot of blues in his sound. He was like a Lester Young brought into the modern age. Him and Dexter Gordon had these famous battles, just legendary stuff. And again, there's some mystery around his dying. He was found out in the desert with his neck broken. And there's rumors that the mafia killed him. And he had a bad drug habit. It might have even been a gambling problem. And it sounds like he was killed by the mafia. Again, there's no real proof of that, I don't think. But it's hard to end up in the desert alone with your neck broken by yourself. And I've seen Casino. I've seen Goodfellas. I know how this shit goes. You end up dead in the desert with your neck broken. I mean, there's only so many options here. So sad ending again for Wardell Gray. It just goes on and on, you know. Chick Webb dies at the age of 34. Chick Webb was one of the geniuses of the Harlem swing sound. And all the white swing bands that were popular in Harlem, not in Harlem, but in New York, in Chicago at the time, Webb was holding down the bluesy gospel of swing music. And his band was fierce. He was a small, diminutive fellow with some health issues. I think he was barely over 4.5 feet tall, just a little guy. He had to build special drums and stuff to make it all happen. But he could outswing anybody. And it was Chick Webb that actually hires Ella Fitzgerald when she was a young gal to swing behind his band. And people would always come to the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem to try to battle with Chick Webb. And very few people walked away from that unscathed. Chick Webb's group would just swing so hard. And it really takes Count Basie's group coming up in the 30s to move swing into a harder dimension of swing than what Chick Webb and his crew were doing in the 20s. He lost him at the age of 34 to spinal tuberculosis. And I don't think many people thought he was going to live much longer than that anyway. He was probably lucky to live that long in some ways. But just a sad story of a great competitive battler and a real founding father of jazz in that era. You gotta love Chick Webb. Addison Farmer, Art Farmer's twin brother, who plays bass on a lot of great sessions in the late 50s and early 60s. He has what's called a bed death, a sudden death syndrome. He just dies in his sleep one night. And they never really figured it out. The autopsy didn't even make anything clear. And so it was just kind of dismissed as he died in his sleep. And I didn't realize Addison and Art were twins until quite recently. And you can't tell them apart being twins, of course. And so you cannot post a picture of Art and have it be Addison and vice versa. Addison was a great player. He was a part of those great records on Argo of the Jazz Tet. He shows up in a lot of different places. Sad that we lost Addison Farmer so young. And it had to be tough on his brother Art to see his brother pass away like that. And it's just, again, I was surprised by how, I don't want to say nonchalant, but just they're not surprised by tragedy, the black people in America. They're just not. They take it in stride. It's just part of, that's why every one of them is just content to be somewhere on a Friday night having a good time with their friends and family. We're here right now. Let's not be down. Each one of us here right now, we made it here. Let's have a good time. And that was something that was overwhelming to me as a DJ in that community. It's just how positive and how thankful they were for simply just being here and being alive on a Friday night. There's no guarantee we're going to make it to next week, but we're here tonight. Let's have a good time. And it was just omnipresent in so many of their personalities and their dialogues. Something I just stumbled across on the regular. I never once have I heard white people talk about that shit in the bar on Friday night. I'm just thankful to be here, thankful to be alive. You know, you see him walking, you're like, hey, brother, what's up? You go give him a big shake and a hug. Like, how you doing? Like, just thankful to be here, brother. That's a common theme in black men in America, especially as they approach middle age. They become cognizant of how endangered their species is, and they're just appreciative of having survived another week. It's something that white Americans just don't have in their vocabulary, their vernacular. They don't see the world that way. It's a very different perception. And my time DJing in the black community is so relevant because it's really how I understand and feel jazz and the blackness that's being emoted and evoked and spoken through those horns. I understand where the community's coming from. This is in the 2010s. How much more true are these things in the 1950s, 1960s, 1940s? It's just a real eye opener for me, and it really drove home the music for me. Age of 33. It's really too young to be dying when you're 33. We lost Lee Morgan. And you say Lee Morgan was only 33. He was only 33. And the guy started recording for Blue Note at a very young age. Those first 6 records of Blue Note in the late 50s are outstanding, hard bop, aggressive. He leaves for a little bit, goes to VJ, comes back to Blue Note, starts doing more boogaloo, but he's also doing like some really edgy stuff, like Search for New Land. Morgan was a great player that crossed briefly into the avant-garde, but would never stray too far into it. Always had the blues and the church in his background. Lee Morgan is one of the institutions of Blue Note. He really is. And he's just an important player that I think in some ways we still underappreciate him because he's so familiar to all of us who are jazz collectors. But Lee Morgan's a very important figure in jazz, and he brought some great composition, great arrangement, great virtuosity. I love his aggression. I love his tension. I love his willingness to tackle the darkness with his playing. He's just one of the great warriors of the hard bop sound going into the 60s. And as we get into the 70s, excuse me, he's still recording prolifically for Blue Note. He must make 20-some records for Blue Note in a 10, 12-year period. It's really impressive. And he's having dalliances with other women, and his common law wife, I don't think they were actually even married, shot him at the club one night. And she served a little bit of time in jail, but not enough. And they made a movie about that recently. They called him Morgan, I think it's called. And they don't really condemn her quite strongly enough for my books. You know what I mean? The man cheated on you, leave him. You don't got to shoot him. You know? And it was a snowy night in New York, like a blizzard style. So that meant the ambulances took twice as long to get there. Took him twice as long to get to the hospital. And he died. And just what a great loss Lee Morgan was. But again, that's part of jazz lore at this point. Morgan being killed, shot, and at the age of 33. And he did all that work in those short years. Pretty impressive. Helen Carr, here's a white gal, died in a car crash, age of 33. Helen Carr's work is not prolific, but her work is outstanding. Most of it exists at Bethlehem, and she also backs up some of the other Bethlehem artists. She'll sometimes sing a song or two on some of their records. Just a great singer. Not a lot's really known about her, but I love Helen Carr's work. Her 2 records at Bethlehem, 90th Floor, and the one with the pink cover with the bodies on the beach. Just a great record, a great emoter. I'm a huge fan of Helen Carr, and I was kind of surprised she died that young, to be honest. But maybe that's why she doesn't have that big a body of work. She died when she was 33. Tragic. Chu Berry, another victim of a car crash. And Chu Berry dies back in the 30s. He's a fantastic player. Chu works with Cab Calloway and kind of really pushes Cab Calloway's orchestra. I think he works with Benny Carter for a while, Count Basie for a while. But it's a brief career, and he dies very young at the age of 33. Chu Berry is one of the great next generation of sax players after Coleman Hawkins. Brilliant player, very emotive, expressive, dynamic. And there's not a lot of recordings out there that you can find. He does some work on Commodore. There's a cool 10-inch out there that plays some of that stuff for you. But it's mostly his work in those big bands where you'll find Chu Berry's body of work. But he's a legend that should be acknowledged and recognized today. Bunny Berrigan, a fantastic clarinetist, if I remember. I should double check that. Sorry, he's a trumpet player. I get him confused with a couple other guys. Bunny Berrigan was a great player. I've only heard a little bit of his stuff. I have a few of his records of recordings on Epic. I think he worked with Ellington for a while. I can't tell you a lot about Bunny Berrigan. I don't know him very well. But again, he dies at the age of 33 from liver hemorrhage and alcohol. So it's just a pretty prevalent, commonplace thing here in America at this point. The great Paul Chambers, and again, one of the most prolific bass players in jazz, and he dies at the age of 33. If you look at the man's discography, canon, his body of work, there's only about 6 or 7 records as a leader, but there's page after page after page of records he's on, and there's half the great records of the late 50s, early 60s has Paul Chambers bass playing on them. He's a great player, tall, a giant of a man. He on Whims of Chambers and some of his work on Blue Note, he's bowling the bass, bringing that element to it. His couple records on VJ are also outstanding. Again, there's some bowing on some of those records. Paul Chambers' Go on VJ is a great record. But his body of work as a sideman is just monstrous. It's like Kenny Burrell big. It's huge. And we lost Paul Chambers, to tuberculosis, drugs, and alcohol, kind of a combination platter there. And really sad, like I said, Chambers left Miles' group with Wynton Kelly and Jimmy Cobb. They had a good trio together for most of the 60s. They were doing great recordings and playing and touring. Record with Wes Montgomery, that's just killer. Smoking at the Half Note, whatever that's called. Sad that we lost Paul Chambers so young. And then Serge Chaloff, the great Boston-born baritone player, ends up part of the West Coast scene somewhat, has a bad drug habit for a number of years. But I just read recently he'd gotten clean. And it's funny because I've always been told he died from drugs. But I guess he got clean. He ended up dying from spinal cancer at the age of 33, which, again, what sadness that is. At the age of 32, we lost the great Lem Winchester, who I just spoke about recently in my Prestige series. He was a cop from Delaware, was a musician on the side, ends up playing at Newport, makes a big impact, gets a recording contract, makes some great records for several different labels, and then somehow he dies in a handgun accident. And it's not really called a murder or a suicide. It's usually referred to as a gun incident. And so I'm not there. I don't really know all the details, but you figure being a cop, he wouldn't be uncomfortable around a handgun. And so that makes me think there must have been some kind of foul play there. But again, I don't really know any more details than that. At the age of 32, we lost Lem. That's a sad year to go. At the age of 31, we lose 3 greats here. The great Eddie Costa in a car crash. Eddie Costa was a great player, one of the coolest piano players you'll ever hear. And unlike most piano players who lay down bass groove with their left hand and then are virtuistic with their right hand, he was as much of a virtuoso with his right as he was with his left. And you'll never hear better low half of the piano virtuosity, just thundering fills with these great middle and lower range keys, than Eddie Costa. The House of Blue Lights record on the Dot label, I wasn't expecting much from that record, and Eddie Costa just floored me. And Eddie Costa was one of those guys that he shows up a lot as a sideman. He's a white cat. He's done a lot of the great, really cool white records that are coming out in the mid 50s. He shows up everywhere. So when I didn't really know who he was, I kept seeing his name, Eddie Costa, Eddie Costa, Eddie Costa, Eddie Costa, as a sideman. I'm like, who's this guy? And I discovered some of his leader albums as a leader. And he's also a great vibraphone player. He'll play the vibes like a champion. His vibe work, though, so he doesn't stand out quite like his piano playing. That low-end virtuosity on the piano is really unique. And if you have a chance to listen to that House of Blue Lights record, I find it flooring. If you play it loud and just listen to what he's doing, what a great player. And he's on so many records in a short period of time. And then it's like he dies in a car crash at the age of 31. The great Sonny Clark. Y'all know I'm a huge Sonny Clark fan. If you're a Blue Note fan of the late 50s, Sonny Clark's such a huge instrumental part of that era. He's just a dynamic force, both musically and socially. There's just something about his persona and his appearance and the looks on his face. There's just a sincerity and an integrity and a depth of character and a desperation and a willingness to fight as a warrior for what he believes in. Sonny Clark comes along across in a lot of ways that are quite unique. And he brings those elements to every session he's a part of, whether as a leader or as a sideman. Sonny Clark shaped the records he was on. And pianists can do that more than most instruments, really. But Clark, he is hard bop in so many ways. Just like I said, as much as Art Blakey is, Sonny Clark is kind of that in the same way as Horace Silver. Just he's a great player as well, but it's his leadership and his social underpinnings and his forceful nature in terms of shaping the sessions that he's in. I just love all Sonny Clark's work. And thankfully, Tone Poet's actually issuing a lot of back catalog that was never issued that Sonny Clark was a big part of in the late 50s. He's just a wonderful, powerful, and important part of the Blue Note canon. And then we also lost the great Ernie Henry to heroin at the age of 31. Ernie Henry makes 3 or 4 great records at Riverside. He was an up-and-coming saxophone player, someone that we had great hope in, and people were talking about this guy's going to be one of the greats, and boom, he was taken from us. So we lost Ernie Henry way too young. And the last on this list is another white guitar player, Eddie Lang, who died from a botched operation at the age of 30. And I don't have any more details on that, but he was a great innovative guitarist, one of the first guys to do electric guitar and amplify it and play solos on records. A real innovator on the guitar. I did a guitar series back a year and a half ago. Learned a lot about Eddie Lang doing it. A real institution and one of the guys that deserves a lot more recognition than he gets. This is a long episode. I hope you all stuck with me. We'll cut it off right here, 51:29. So again, it's almost an hour long. But so we'll have no need for long outros today. But subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Hit that like button. Smash it, as they say. Hit the bell for alerts so you know when new album, new videos are coming out. If you want to support the channel, go to Patreon or buy some merchandise from the merch store in the description below. And then stay tuned for part 3 on this series where we talk about all the great jazz players who died in their 20s. That's a shorter list, but it's still a profound list. And has some great talent that was taken from us so young that these are the names where you really go, wow, what could this guy have done had he been around longer? And even on this list here, I wish we had Dolphy longer. I wish we had Eddie Costa longer. I wish we had Chu Berry longer, Helen Carr, Lee Morgan, Lem Winchester. So many of these players, we wish we had Oscar Pettiford. Wish we had more of these guys. But they all left their mark, and they're part of the jazz canon, whether you know them or not. These are important players all, and I'm happy to share these guys with you. We'll talk to you all soon. You all be safe, be blessed. Peace.